My name is Rocco. I'm a passionate drone pilot from Northern Virginia, and today I have 5 tips to share with you about how to take your drone videos to the next level. Today I'm going to be focusing specifically on tips for when you're actually out flying, and the next video will be focusing on the tips in the editing phase. So do be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications if you want to see that video. Anyways, let's get straight into things. Starting off with my first tip for you. Have the right camera settings. And this is sort of a broad topic, so let's dive in a little bit deeper. As far as camera settings go, you need to be shooting in manual mode. If you've never done that before, let me tell you why you should. Shooting in manual mode gives you full control over your drone's camera, and it prevents nasty things like exposure and white balance changes from happening mid-shot. If you don't know how to use the manual controls on your drone, I'll give you a quick rundown. Most drones will give you the option to control both the shutter speed and ISO. Shutter speed controls how long light is allowed to enter the sensor for each frame in a video. The higher the shutter speed, the sharper an image will be, but with a high shutter speed comes a very quick window for the light to reach the sensor, so in turn the image will get darker the higher the shutter speed gets. When shooting video, the ideal shutter speed is always going to be double what your frame rate is. So if you're shooting 24 frames per second video, you're going to go for something around 1/48th, although not all drones have 1/48th because of the increments, you might be closer to 1/50th of a second, but that's close enough. Having the shutter speed set like this will allow for a realistic and natural amount of motion blur to be captured in the video. Lowering the shutter speed to be twice the amount of your frame rate can cause some problems though. Remember how I said that the higher the shutter speed gets, the darker the image gets? Well, it's the opposite when you lower the shutter speed. If you lower the shutter speed too much, the image will get too bright. Therefore, if you're filming in broad daylight, you may want to invest in getting neutral density filters for your drone, which essentially act as sunglasses for the camera, darkening the image so you can still get that nice natural shutter speed. While I personally do own ND filters for my Autel Evo, I don't always use them because they're a little bit of a hassle to get on the drone just because of the way it's designed. And when I'm chasing sunrises and sunsets, I often don't have the time to set the drone down, unscrew the clear filter, and then put on an ND filter. It just takes a little too much time in certain circumstances. So I end up compensating by raising my shutter speed to get a proper exposure, which therefore doesn't give me the natural amount of motion blur that I need. But in the next video, I will be covering a technique that I use to add motion blur in post, and it's a little bit easier than you think. Now that we've covered shutter speed, let's talk about ISO, which is another important function of your drone's camera. In simple terms, the ISO measures your camera's sensitivity to light. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive it will be. Therefore, the higher ISO is, the brighter your image will be, and my personal recommendation is that you always adjust your shutter speed first and try to keep your ISO at the absolute minimum. If your drone has ISO 100 as its lowest, set it to that. The reason for that being is when you push the ISO higher and higher, the more noisy your image will be, and you will see artifacting and color loss, as well as nasty grain that just doesn't look good. So always try to keep your ISO at the absolute minimum and adjust your shutter speed first. Now that we've covered shutter speed and ISO, there is one more factor for shooting in manual that not exactly all drones have, but I figured would be important to mention nevertheless, and that is aperture. Aperture controls how much light is actually let into your camera's sensor. Usually the more expensive drones will have adjustable apertures. Most drones, including the one I fly, has a fixed aperture, and honestly there isn't really anything wrong with that. When you're in the air, your drone's focus is pretty much always set to infinity because of the sensor size. Closing down the aperture won't really change the depth of field too much unless you have a massive sensor. Like, for example, this camera I'm shooting on right now is a full frame camera with a lens with an f1.4 aperture, but I can close it down to f22 if I wanted to, but I don't know why I would do that other than to get everything in focus. On a drone, you don't really have that option. While aperture does control how much light is being let in and depth of field, it's not a huge factor on drones, so I won't really go super in depth to it. The most commonly known examples of drones that have mechanical apertures built into them is the Mavic 2 Pro, and actually now the Mavic 3, and the Autel Evo 2 Pro, which both have controllable apertures from f2.8 to f11, I believe. Most other drones just have a fixed aperture of f2.8. And if you can't control your drone's aperture, like I said, the best other way to control your shutter speed and get the natural motion blur would be to use ND filters. And for most people, including me, that's just fine. So now that we've covered general camera settings, it's time to talk about some additional camera settings that you might want to consider using. The first of which being shooting in the absolute highest resolution your drone has to offer. Trust me, even though the file sizes will be massive, it will be worth it. On my drone, the Autel Evo, I have access to shooting DCI 4K, which is just ever so slightly wider than the standard 4K UHD frame size that is offered on most drones. Having this high resolution typically also means you'll have a higher bitrate. My drone shoots 4K video at up to 60 frames per second with a bitrate of 100 megabits per second, which is pretty good for a drone. And speaking of frames per second, I would highly recommend you shoot at 24 frames per second or 23.976, whatever your drone shoots. It's weird. Sometimes it's 24, sometimes it's 23.976. If you're mixing footage between two things that don't have the exact same frame rate, there will be problems, so it's always best to line up your frame rates to be exact if you can. Obviously, if you're shooting slow motion, 60 frames per second, you can slow it down to 24 frames per second in post, and then you'll have smooth playback. But just keep that in mind. I used to shoot and edit my drone videos in 60 frames per second, but now I do it all in 24 frames per second because it's a lot more natural to the human eye, and it's a little less taxing on your computer because there's a lot less frames. It's also what's used in most cinema productions. Obviously, there are a few films that go crazy with 120 frames per second. It looks kind of weird, but kind of cool at the same time. It's all stylistic at the end of the day. I'm not gonna come up to you and be like, if you're not shooting 24 frames per second, you're bad. That's what people did to me when I was shooting 60 frames per second. I changed to 24 on my own free will, and I decided that, hey, I like this better. So don't let people tell you what frame rate to shoot. I just personally think that 24 frames per second is better. And the last thing that I'd like to talk about pertaining to camera settings is shooting in log. Shooting in log will give you the most flexibility for editing and post, and a lot of drones now have the option to shoot 10-bit video, which is significantly better in terms of its color readout than 8-bit video, and it just allows for so much more control over the image in post. So if you want to have the most control of your image in post, be sure to shoot in log, and I'll be covering how to grade log footage from your drone in the sequel to this video. Make sure you have notifications on so you don't miss that. Now that we've covered camera settings, it's time to talk about looking for interesting compositions. This is actually when you're out flying now. So we've covered the settings you should use, and now we're talking about composition. Really, this starts with planning ahead. If you know where you're going to film ahead of time, you'll have a better idea of what shots you can and cannot get within a location. Obviously, Google Maps isn't able to fully show you what a location will be like, and it's always important to scout out the area once you arrive in order to make sure you're not going to have any hazards while flying. But you should definitely do research on looking for interesting compositions that are going to make the viewer more intrigued in what they're looking at. Recently, I've become, I'll say it, obsessed with fire towers and flying my drone around them. And I like them a lot because they stand out really well from the scenery around them. And having a subject that stands out from the background is really going to set your drone videos apart. But the first thing you want to do is make sure you have an eye for composition. And that kind of starts with understanding the rule of thirds. Go into your drone settings and see if there's an option to turn on a composition grid such as the rule of thirds. It is a grid that divides a shot into 9 different sections, which are to be used as guides for composition. The first type of composition you'll want to use as a drone pilot is center composition, which is by far the most common way to compose a shot on a drone by putting the subject in the center of the image between the grid lines. The next common type of composition is side composition, where you get to frame the subject in either the right or left thirds of the image. As you can see, there are a lot of possibilities when it comes to these types of compositions, but we've just scratched the surface. For any given shot, once you've chosen which vertical column you want to place your subject in, you're only halfway done. Now you have to choose which horizontal column you want to place the subject in, and depending on where you place the subject, you are changing the meaning of the composition. For instance, by placing the subject in the center of the grid, you're emphasizing focus on that subject specifically. But if you place the subject in the top part of the grid, you are emphasizing scale. In this instance, we're emphasizing the scale of the mountain, leading the viewer's eyes up to the fire tower at the top. And if we place the subject at the bottom, the meaning changes once again, and we are drawing emphasis to the sky. If we were to move the subject to either adjacent side of the image again, the meaning of the composition would continue to change. For example, if we place the tower in the top left portion of the image, we'd be leading the viewer's eyes up to the subject diagonally, while also emphasizing the scale of the mountain. As you can see, the way you compose a shot can completely transform the story it tells. So next time you're setting up to shoot a shot, think about what you're trying to tell the viewer about the subject and experiment with different angles and compositions. That is how you compose great shots. And obviously, there are so many more things that you'll learn over time by just practicing composition. Sometimes it's a cool idea to break the rules of composition. You don't always have to have a level shots. That's why people think FPV drones are really cool. It's a new perspective, and it breaks the rule of thirds a lot of the time, but it's unique. Use your best judgment and keep practicing, and you'll be getting great compositions in no time for sure. The next tip to take your drone shots to the next level is to add dynamic motion into your videos. A lot of drone shots appear boring because there's usually just one direction of motion. We can change that. If you want your drone videos to stand out, you'll want to combine different types of motion to create more interesting shots. For example, let's take a shot going head-on towards a subject. Sure, it's kind of cool, but we can add so much more to this composition. What I would do to enhance this shot is to use the drone's gimbal to slowly look upwards as it moves forward, revealing the subject. And by doing that, we're adding another axis of motion. It is so much more interesting than the original, and let's take a look at one more example, the orbit shot. Orbiting shots are commonly used by pilots to showcase the subject. While doing an orbit shot is certainly more advanced than simply flying towards or away from a subject, we can still spice it up more. What I do to spice up orbit shots is use the gimbal to tilt up, revealing the subject as the drone moves around it. Can you see the trend now? Using the gimbal in conjunction with the movements of your drone can lead to more dynamic shots. However, pulling off those shots can be a little more tricky than you think. My next tip for you is to make sure that you tune your drone's controls. For example, if you were going to get in a car and drive it, you wouldn't just leave the seat in a horrible position for driving. You would adjust it so it feels just right and so you're comfortable with driving it, right? Therefore, unless your drone is perfect right out of the box, which it isn't, you'll need to tune your controls. My drone, the Autel Evo, has options for controlling the responsiveness of the sticks so that I can get smoother movements. Most drones also have the ability for the pilot to customize the speed and responsiveness of the gimbal control wheel so that your gimbal motions can be smoother too. So dive into your drone settings and experiment with the tuning until you get settings that you like. The last tip I have for you all today is to know your drone's limitations. This is quite simple. You don't want to put your drone into a circumstance where you're going to fly it dangerously or where you're going to push it to the limits that you know you shouldn't be going past. Some drones are great at operating in lower temperatures and some are not. Some are better at operating in higher temperatures. Some drones are great at maneuvering at high speeds, and other drones are really nimble and can weave between objects. Know what your drone can do, its strengths and weaknesses, and don't push it. Seriously. And at the end of the day, it's more important that you land your drone safely with all of your great footage on the SD card than risking it for a shot that you could lose the drone and your footage on. So use common sense while flying and also just enjoy the experience, because flying a drone is something that filmmakers 50 years ago would have gone crazy over. They are awesome tools that have completely elevated and changed the way that we make videos nowadays. So cherish the fact that you have a drone and cherish the time you spend flying it, because really it's quite awesome. So get out there, use common sense, and get flying. If you enjoyed this video, do be sure to drop a like on it and maybe even consider subscribing to my channel. I appreciate you watching, especially to the end, and do be sure to turn on notifications so you don't miss the part 2 of this video where I go into the editing side of drone videos. My name's Rocco. I will see you all in the next video. Peace.